You've likely seen it. People submerging themselves in freezing cold water to then emerge victoriously and profess all the potential health benefits that a refreshing cold plunge can provide. Now, I myself have been known to participate in such activities, and we'll get into what happened to my clothes there a little bit later on in the video. But does cold plunging actually work? Does it really stimulate physiological adaptations and provide health benefits? Because there are claims that it could help with recovery from sports and exercise, reduce inflammation and boost the immune system, help manage stress, anxiety, and depression, and even help regulate blood sugar levels. So in today's video, we're going to discuss if cold plunging can really provide some of these health benefits, and of course, talk about some protocols on how to perform a proper cold plunge. It's going to be a frigid one, so let's jump right into this. So let's start off with what we certainly know about cold exposure. Cold is one of the most potent natural stressors to the human body, which means exposure to cold water will definitely stimulate a strong physiological response in that moment. This response would include the release of chemicals known as catecholamines, which includes dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And as an FYI, epinephrine and norepinephrine are also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now, these catecholamines would cause further reactions to occur, things like increases in heart rate, vasoconstriction of peripheral blood vessels or blood vessels out in your extremities in an attempt to shunt blood to the core of the body. You'd also see increases in respiratory rate, how fast you're breathing, and of course, your brain telling you to get out of there. Now, once you got out of that cold water, you might also experience something known as the afterdrop, and we'll explain the details of what the afterdrop effect is once we get into the protocols of cold plunging. But all of these reactions are essentially your sympathetic nervous system ramping up. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is often nicknamed the fight or flight system. And it's likely not that surprising to you that exposure to extreme temperatures would ramp up your sympathetic nervous system or your fight or flight response. But when you dig a little bit deeper into this fight or flight response specific to cold exposure, it's just a matter of time before you'd come across this discussion about brown adipose tissue or brown fat. Brown fat is a remarkable tissue and is different from the more typical fat that we find throughout the body, known as white fat. Brown fat gets its darker color from its rich and extensive blood supply, as well as from the brown fat cells containing numerous specialized pigmented mitochondria. This extensive blood supply and these specialized mitochondria give brown fat its function, which is thermogenesis, or in other words, its ability to generate heat. The mitochondria in the brown fat cells are incredible. Normally in our previous videos, or maybe in your previous biology class, you learned that the mitochondria will burn through carbohydrates or fats to produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. And remember, ATP is just the energy currency of our cells, adenosine triphosphate. But this process in the mitochondria of the brown fat is uncoupled. These mitochondria actually contain a unique protein compared to all the other mitochondria throughout the body called uncoupling protein 1. But what does this even mean? What does this mean that the process is uncoupled? Well, the mitochondria in the brown fat pretty much make no ATP. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I learned that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell because it generates ATP. Well, these brown fat mitochondria will be powerhouses for a different reason. Instead of burning through carbohydrates and fats to generate a considerable amount of ATP, these mitochondria will burn through the fats and the carbohydrates to generate considerable amounts of heat. And because the brown fat has such an extensive blood supply, the heat generated in these special mitochondria can be carried away to other body tissues in order to help warm up the body. So you can see how brown fat could help with cold exposure. But let me give you some additional details on one of the ways brown fat is activated. Brown fat cells also have receptors for some of the catecholamines, those chemicals that were released during the fight or flight or that sympathetic response. So you jump in some cold water, activate the fight or flight or sympathetic response, release some of those catecholamines, and some of those will bind to the receptors on the fat cells, activating the brown fat to help keep you warm. What's also interesting is that we have much more brown fat when we're newborns compared to when we're adults. And a newborn that gets a maximal sympathetic stimulation due to cold exposure and activating that brown fat can increase their metabolic rate by 100%. Now, in an adult, because we have less brown fat, that increase of metabolic rate by activating our brown fat is more like about 15%, much less than what a newborn could do. However, New information is showing that this could potentially be improved upon with repeated cold exposure. So how does repeated cold exposures or cold plunging change the brown fat? Well, we obviously know that in the moment it will stimulate the brown fat to generate heat, but are there any long-term changes or adaptations that occurs with this? You'll often hear people say that repeated cold plunging will build up the brown fat. Well, when we typically think about building up fat, or at least that white fat, we think of it literally getting thicker and bigger and even gaining weight. But it's not like people who do repeated cold plunging build up this visible thickness of brown fat like over their clavicles or their mid-back or their neck, which are some common places where you find brown fat. Keep in mind they are finding it in other locations throughout the body. But what we do know that happens, because we're not getting this visible buildup of thickness per se, is that the mitochondria in those brown fat cells will increase in number with repeated cold plunging exposures. Plus, the mitochondria that one does have in those brown fat cells will also become more efficient. So back to the benefits of cold plunging, starting with how cold plunging could potentially help regulate blood sugar levels. Now, if you've watched some of our videos in the past, you may have seen me geek out about how certain types of exercise could increase the number, size, and efficiency of mitochondria in the heart and skeletal muscle fibers. And increasing the mitochondria in these tissues will increase the amount of energy or ATP you could produce, thereby improving your fitness and exercise capacity. But we also know that increasing the mitochondria in the heart and skeletal muscles will improve your overall metabolic efficiency. Essentially, if you have a lot of awesome, effective mitochondria, this pretty much tells your body how to utilize fats and carbohydrates as effectively as possible, and will result in improved blood glucose or blood sugar levels and increased insulin sensitivity. So apply this idea to increasing the number of mitochondria in the brown fat due to repeated cold exposure. Yes, the mitochondria in the brown fat are going to produce heat rather than ATP, but they will still utilize carbohydrates and fats in order to generate that heat, and therefore can have a similar effect at improving overall metabolic efficiency with potential improvements in blood sugar levels as well as increased insulin sensitivity. And on to another potential benefit of cold plunging, and that is reducing inflammation. There are some studies that have shown improvement in inflammatory markers in the blood due to cold exposure. Now, we've been using cold exposure and ice for acute injuries for many years. Although there are some critics on how much ice or cold exposure can help with the inflammation during an acute injury, it's definitely pretty clear that it can help with the perception of pain. There also have been reports of improvement in symptoms with patients that have certain inflammatory conditions. So there is some encouraging evidence that cold plunging can have a positive effect on inflammation. There just still needs to be some more research on this, as well as some additional research needs to be done on another claim about cold plunging: improvements or boosts in the immune system. There have been some studies that have shown an increase in the number of white blood cells with cold exposure, while others did not. But there was a very interesting randomized controlled trial performed in the Netherlands where they had people take a 30, 60, or 90-second cold shower. And what they found was that the people that took the cold showers had a 29% reduction in sick-related work absences. And the caveat and the interesting thing with that is that those that had that 29% reduction didn't actually have a significant decrease in the number of days they felt sick. They were just more likely to go to work, which would imply something else is going on there, such as an improvement in something like mental fortitude and resilience, which leads us on to some of our next set of benefits with cold plunging: improvements in managing stress, anxiety, and depression. There are multiple reports and studies that have shown improvements in stress, anxiety, and depression with cold plunging and cold exposure. Now, research with mental health can be a little challenging at times. One, there are multiple factors that influence our mental health. Two, it's not like you can measure anxiety and depression in the bloodstream like you could, say, a blood sugar level or even inflammatory markers. And three, most of these studies are people reporting how they feel. But again, most of those reports are showing quite a positive correlation with cold plunging and improvements in mental health. And something else to consider: is it the cold plunging all by itself that's contributing to these reported improvements in mental health? Or could it be other factors that are also contributing, such as just being outside in nature? Also, people will often cold plunge in cold plunge groups, where they're interacting with other human beings, which could potentially create some improvements in mental health as well. So it could be multiple factors, the cold plunging, being out in nature, interacting with other humans, that could be accounting or contributing to this overall improvement in mental health. Now I can give you my own personal anecdote, which is when I've done cold plunging, I've felt this natural high afterwards and an improvement in my mood, and also had improvement in energy levels throughout the day. But before we move on from the mental health, I do want to come back to this stress response and potential improvements in the stress response that can occur with cold plunging. So we have definitely established that the body will have a sympathetic response to the stress of cold water exposure. And even when you know it's coming, which is the case when you deliberately put yourself in cold water, it almost feels like this stress response is completely out of your control. Which for the most part it is, because your sympathetic nervous system is a branch of your involuntary autonomic nervous system, which is trying to protect you. However, even with this being primarily an involuntary response, repeated cold exposures can train or almost tone the sympathetic nervous system to be less activated during subsequent cold exposures. You may feel like even after a handful of cold plunge sessions, you might be able to control your breathing a little bit more easily. You may not feel quite as shocked or ramped up as you did during previous sessions. And this could possibly create cross-adaptation, meaning that there are some reports that suggest you could take these adaptations of your sympathetic nervous system into your daily life. Could it help you manage daily stress more effectively? Could you be less reactive to situations that may have ramped you up more prior to having these cold exposure adaptations? And again, you could make the argument that deliberately doing something that you know is going to make you uncomfortable could build mental fortitude and resilience that you could possibly also apply to your daily life. And one last benefit we'll discuss prior to getting into the details of how to do a proper cold plunge protocol, and that is enhanced recovery from exercise. It has been shown that cold water immersion can reduce muscle soreness. So you might be thinking, all right, after this crazy strength workout, I'm going to jump right into that cold water. Well, you may want to actually consider some of your exercise goals prior to just doing a cold plunge for recovery. Because yes, it has been shown that cold water immersion can reduce muscle soreness, but it has also been shown that cold water immersion directly after a strength workout could actually blunt or inhibit some of the processes necessary for increased muscle mass. Now, this isn't a huge negative effect. It only inhibits this by about 10 to 20%. So it's not like you wouldn't make any gains in muscle mass if you included cold plunging after like strength workouts. You would again just kind of have to assess your goals and figure out what's most important to you, because if your main goal is to absolutely maximize increases in muscle mass, then you may want to avoid cold plunging, or at least avoid it directly after a strength workout. And this is where we can get quite creative with these cold plunging protocols. Yep, it just went. And you're naked. All right, thumbnail it. Oh my gosh! It's freaking cold up here! And it is worth discussing cold water versus cold air. You can get benefits from being exposed to cold air, but cold water is going to be obviously more intense, more effective. And we all know this from life experience. If you were to walk outside, maybe you were taking your garbage cans out on a winter day and it was 35 degrees and you're in your shorts and t-shirt for 1 to 2 minutes, that's going to feel a bit different than if you are in cold water that's 35 degrees for 1 to 2 minutes. But when submerging yourself in cold water, you want to submerge up to the neck. And you want the water to be cold enough that you definitely want to get out, but you could stay in it for a few minutes safely. It's hard to give an exact temperature, but if you were like in the mid 60s, probably not cold enough. As an example, I keep my cold tank at home at about 45 degrees, mid 40s, but I'm gonna try to work that down a little bit as I get better at doing this. And so you could start a little bit higher and then work your way down. Now, the other piece of the protocol is time. How much time do you need to spend in the cold water? And what they found was 11 minutes. And before you freak out, it's 11 minutes per week. So you could break that up into 2 to 4 sessions for a few minutes at a time and still get these cold plunge benefits. And I do want to go back to that potential benefit of reducing muscle soreness. Remember, We said that if your main goal is maximizing muscle mass, you may not want to do one of these cold plunge sessions directly after that workout. But the beauty of this is if you can break it up into 2 to 4 sessions, you could strategically place some of these cold plunge sessions on different days that aren't directly after those strength training sessions. And another thing I want to go back to is something that I mentioned earlier in the video, the after drop. Remember, when you get into the cold water, we're going to have that sympathetic response, heart rate's going to increase, and we also mentioned vasoconstriction of the blood vessels in your periphery, so like in your extremities. And that's going to shunt the blood to the core in an attempt to keep that area warm. Now, when you come up out of the water, your periphery, your extremities, are going to warm up a little bit. And so those blood vessels will start to relax and open up again, and then more blood can come back out into your periphery. But as that blood comes into the periphery, it gets cooled. And it is a circulatory system, so eventually some of that cooled blood will go back to the core, and you'll get this decrease in core body temperature, and this is what's known as the afterdrop, and this could even potentially start to induce shivering. Now, shivering isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it is actually another way that brown fat can get stimulated. Obviously, you could take this to the extreme and get into dangerous situations. You certainly wouldn't want to get hypothermic or something like frostbite. Now, this is much less likely if you're doing cold plunges at your house where you have easy access to warm yourself up. Admittedly, my cold plunge situation was a little bit more risky, being 2.5 miles up the mountain in very cold weather. And we can critique this and know that I kind of wussed out. I couldn't sit in that water for minutes at a time up to my neck. I was probably in there a little above waist deep for, a little over 30 seconds. But as soon as I submerged my head down below, totally threw off the neck protocol there, I was done and wanted to get out. But what you didn't see behind the camera, because I was indecent, if you will, it took me 1 to 2 minutes just to get my wet socks off and put my new dry socks on, all while I'm dripping wet naked. So there was probably some additional cold exposure benefit just by dripping wet rather than sitting out there completely dry in the air. But whether you decide to cold plunge at your house or somewhere outside, please start slow and be safe with this. And keep in mind, cold plunging is not meant to replace other health practices, such as consistent exercise and healthy eating habits. It's in addition to those other health habits, almost like the icing on the cake that might help you get some additional health benefits. I personally will cold plunge. I enjoy it, at least after I get out of the water, and I feel better for it. So hopefully this video gave you enough information where you could decide if this is something that you want to incorporate and how to potentially incorporate it into your health routine. And of course, I want to say thank you for supporting our channel and watching all of our crazy videos. Like and subscribe, it helps to support our channel. And of course, we'll see you next time.